Hello La Raza, supporters of La Raza, thank you for being here. There's a very famous phrase that says that history is written from the eyes of the conqueror. When it comes to the Aztecs, this cannot be farther from the truth. That Aztecs were demonized for who they were, for their religion, in an attempt to try to make them seem inhuman or animals. This has been done also in Nazi Germany to try to demonize the Jews and for Hitler to excuse their extermination and the horrible things they did to them. This was not the first time that happened. This happened for the Aztecs, where probably 90% of the Aztec population, especially the nobility, was exterminated. But what are the Aztecs and what can we take from them? I want to make this episode to try to give an introduction to their cosmology. This is also a continuation episode of my Mesoamerican magic, because the cosmology of the Aztec is deeply intertwined with mythology and with magic and with time, and then of course their environment. And so what is it that the Aztecs really meant when they performed sacrifices? Were they really cannibalistic? And if they were in fact cannibalistic, what made them cannibalistic? These also in our egalitarian society can become a little too grotesque. But the fact of the matter is that the Aztecs were in constant war. And so we need to understand the perspective of the Aztecs in a constant war from their perspective and try to understand their cosmology and their magic. Thank you very much, and let's go. Many of the writers of Arqueología Mexicana have written the statement that the Aztecs and most Mesoamerican cultures did what other cultures have done. They have adopted their religion and their mythology and their perspective on cosmology from their own everyday life interpretation. For the Aztecs, this was deeply intertwined within their everyday action. Everything had to do with the religious perspective. Everything had to do with their connection with nature, with their gods, and the perspective that and the kind of esoteric perspective they had upon their own reality. First, we need to understand that the Aztecs came from an exhausting way of life. When they arrived into Mexico-Tenochtitlan, which now is Mexico City, they were under horrible pressure. They were not allowed to hunt, they were not allowed to harvest, they were not allowed to plant. They only survived out of eating roots and worms. They couldn't also fish, even though there was a lot of fish back then in Mexico-Tenochtitlan. And this created a very oppressive mentality of how are we going to survive? And having the oppression of the tribes or nations around that time that had their foot on their necks. And so these might have created a very violent perspective of the Aztecs with their own reality. The Aztecs were able to survive by eating and trying to scrap whatever food they could. But despite the great oppression in which they live under, they were great mercenaries. They were mercenaries to people like the Toltecs, to the local kingdoms of Mexico-Tenochtitlan, like Tlatelolco, like Acolhuacan. And this mercenary tradition that they had became their status quo until they were conquered, unquote, by the Spaniards. And this type of mentality also mixed and intertwined with their mythology and with their magic. Let me tell you a story. The tradition back then was that the Aztecs were not allowed to fish or hunt or harvest crops unless they were married within the nobility or one of the nations that occupied Mexico Tenochtitlan, like Tlatelolco or Acolhuacan or Texcoco. And therefore, they needed to marry within that line to be able to survive. They needed to survive there because their god, Huitzilopochtli, told them that they needed to settle there. And it was not only a matter of mythology. Mexico Tenochtitlan, it was a great place for them to survive. We have to understand that back in those days, it was nation against nation, and there was no quarrel. Everybody wanted what everybody else whatever everybody else had. This had to do with food, women, weapons, or slaves. They were at constant warfare with one another. There was not an egalitarian society like we have today, which is formed with countries and treaties and armies. Back then, it was everyone against everyone, and it was constant warfare. There was not a generation that did not see warfare. And therefore, the Aztecs were able to serve the other nations as mercenaries. And in one of these instances, the king of Acolhuacan, he used the services of the Aztecs, and as a promise, he was going to give him one of his daughters. The tradition or the legend goes that this was an unwinnable war. The king of Acolhuacan just wanted the Aztecs to be exterminated, and as a result, this war was going to be an unwinnable war. But despite all odds, the Aztecs were able to defeat the enemy of the Acolhuacans, and they inherited or were granted one of the daughters of the king of Acolhuacan, so that they could now fish and hunt and be able to harvest. But instead of the Aztecs marrying that particular woman, they performed something that it was quite violent, to say the least. They invited the king of Acolhuacan for their religious ceremony. The king of Acolhuacan probably thought that this was going to be a marriage ceremony. It was not. When the king of Acolhuacan arrived to the festivities, he saw his daughter's skin flayed, being worn by a priest. Now, this is a very violent festival. It is dedicated to Xipetotec. Xipetotec is the goddess of freedom, of harvest, and abundance. And the tradition in which the Aztecs were to celebrate this is to grab a woman, a noble woman, and flay her, to basically take off her skin. And the skin was drenched in either ocli or milk to try to make the skin foldable, and the priest was able to put that skin and perform a dance with certain type of music. And this was a very violent introduction of the Aztecs into the kingdoms of Mexico Tenochtitlan around that time. In fact, back then it was not Mexico Tenochtitlan. The reason why it's called Tenochtitlan is because Tenoch was one of the kings, one of the founding kings of the Aztecs, and so they called it the land of Tenochtitlan. And so why did the Aztecs do this? And this is a very violent way to try to make friends in Mexico, what was Mexico City. And so why did they do this? The reason why the Aztecs do this is out of rebellion. They did it out of this is kind of statement of saying, we are not going to be oppressed by you. We are going to do whatever we want, and we are here to stay. And we don't need to obey your laws. That was the statement of the Aztecs. And that was an introductory ritual to the rest of their existence in Mexico Tenochtitlan. And they eventually realized that they were not going to be able to defeat all of the kingdoms of Tenochtitlan or the surrounding area, and so therefore they formed alliances like the Triple Alliance, which a lot of people now know as the Aztecs. Of course, they had enemies. They had the people of Texcoco, which ultimately ended up being their downfall. And we cannot divide the mythological, magical perspective of what the Aztecs believed during their sacrifices and their religious ceremonies with their political maneuvers. Now, from the time of Tenoch until the time of Moctezuma or Citláhuac, if we want to see it as the last Aztec Tlatoani king. By the way, Tlatoani doesn't mean king; it means great speaker. And Tlatoani, he was a god, and so it requires a little bit of an explanation. The Tlatoani was a individual that spoke for everyone, hence the statement Tlatoani. And the Tlatoani, even though he was considered a god, he was under other gods, very similar to Egypt, where the king is kind of a representation of Horus, but there is still Isis and there is Osiris. For the Aztecs, there was Huitzilopochtli and there was Tezcatlipoca, kind of like the day and the night. And the center and the heart of the Aztec city, it was the main pyramid. We can see this in the architecture of many other Mesoamerican cities. You have Mayapan, where the main pyramid also has Quetzalcoatl right at the bottom. You have Chichen Itza. You have many different types of pyramids, cities that have pyramids as their focal point. And this is the reason why. And it has to do a lot with magic, and it has to do a lot with mythology. The pyramid, it is the center and the heart of the universe for the Aztecs in this regard, and also for the Teotihuacans. And we know that the Aztecs believed that the design of the pyramid, it was intertwined with the design of the universe, let's say, because it was the center and the four cardinal points of the universe, but it originates from the perspective of the pyramid. Once again, this is very geocentric, kind of like the Catholic Church, but so it has to do a lot with politics. We cannot also separate mythology and magic with their politics. Each one of the corners of the pyramid was dedicated to a particular type of life. And so, for example, in the north, we have the Wall of Skulls, that's on Pantli. And this Wall of Skulls is representative of the land of the dead. These also have some very intertwined political and religious significance, because the skulls that were in that Tzompantli, they were the skulls of people that were either sacrificed or captured during wars, and they were displayed on the north part of the pyramid to basically say, we place these people in Mictlan, which is kind of like hell, or one of the levels of Mictlan. And so therefore the Aztecs not only did that in a religious perspective, but also in a political perspective or strategy, shall we say, of saying, if you try to attack us, or if you try to not do what we want you to do, this is what we will do to you. So therefore, the Aztecs had a very elaborate way of dressing their warriors. They had a very elaborate way of conducting sacrifices, a very elaborate way to conduct ceremonies, and it was done with the perspective of inflicting fear on their enemies. The Aztecs within themselves, although they were slightly violent, they were not always violent. They were a very prosperous nation. They were when the Spanish arrived into Tenochtitlan, they said that Mexico Tenochtitlan was bigger than Seville, one of the biggest cities around that time in Spain. It was bigger than London. It was bigger than Rome, and there were there was a lot of population in Mexico Tenochtitlan, and you cannot have, if we look at this from an anthropological perspective, a civilization cannot have that much population unless they took care of their population. This means sanitary conditions, this means healthcare, this means providing people with food, this means bringing in people to serve and to maintain the streets and the land. And so there it is understandable that the Aztecs were not just bloodthirsty killers. They were people that loved nature. They were people that loved people. They were people that loved their connection with their gods and the communication that they have with the four corners and the center of the universe as the Aztecs saw it. Now, the main Aztec pyramid did not only represent the four corners and the center of the universe, which had mythological and magical perspectives, because the Aztecs loved to do magic. And in fact, human sacrifice, it is obvious that it was meant to be magical. This comes from the story between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was a god that did not like to perform human sacrifices or even blood sacrifices. He preferred to do flower or herb sacrifices, shall we say. But the servants of Tezcatlipoca tried to trick Quetzalcoatl to perform magic, not with flowers or with herbs, but with people. And so there was a tradition of some people being bloodthirsty to try to conduct sacrifices, but this was not the whole encompassing for the Aztecs. The Aztecs also honored Quetzalcoatl, and they did in fact honor what he represented, which was light, knowledge, balance. And along with the perspective of having the heavens and hells, all encapsulated within the main Aztec pyramid, the Aztecs were able to determine who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell. Now, these requires separate episodes to try to explain the heavens and the hell for the Aztecs. Let's just try to simplify it in this introductory video by saying that the Aztecs believe in 7 hells, shall we say, or steps towards the ultimate hell, which was not that bad. And there were 13 heavens. These heavens and these hells were kind of governed by different gods. And depending on how people died or how people lived their lives, or how were they compliant with the Aztec laws or defiant to Aztec laws, therefore people went to those particular places, either to heaven or to hell. Now, of course, this is also a very political strategy, a very useful political strategy to try to utilize people in a particular way. Let me explain. The Aztecs were big on warfare, like I said, and so one of the greatest heavens that they can go to, it was the heaven where Huitzilopochtli reigned. And the only way to go there, it was to die in battle. And there, the rewards of being in this particular heaven is being under the rulership of Huitzilopochtli and even come back as a hummingbird. And this is one of the reasons why the Aztecs were so concentrated in every single moment to gain the sympathy of the gods, because they knew that if they were to err from a particular way of being, they could be sentenced to an afterlife of horrible torment. Much like the Catholic religion and Dante's Inferno, where we see if a particular person did something bad, he's going to end up in a particular region of hell, or if he did something good, he's going to end up in a particular region of Paradiso. Now, each one of the corners of the pyramid also had their own particular heaven. For example, the west side of the pyramid, that was dedicated to the heaven of Tlaloc, which is the god of rain and water. And in this particular heaven, there was going to be a lot of clean water. There was going to be food and wonderful things. Now, let me try to explain a little bit about the rulerships of the heavens. People in Mesoamerica that did not have a king or were protected or under a particular nation, if they were destined to either be killed or become slaves. And this was one of the most horrible existences for a particular group of people, not having a king to defend them. Now, the northern part of the pyramid, as I said, it was dedicated to Mictlan. And Mictlan was under the god Mictlatecutli. And Mictlatecutli had 9 different levels of hell. This requires a separate episode to try to explain which one of the hells. But it just basically means that a particular dead person, or recently dead person, needed to go through 9 different stages of hell to try to get to the kingdom of Mictlatecutli and be under his lordship. And there was, once there with Mictlatecutli, there was an opportunity to be reincarnated. Much like the Indians, the Aztecs also believed in an honor-based form of reincarnation, where based on the life that they lived on Earth, they were able to have a particular afterlife or reincarnation in another life. The Indians, for example, have a very descriptive way of doing their thing, of describing what deeds are done and what reincarnation is going to merit, what merit is going to. The Bhagavad Gita has a kind of equation, or shall we say a correspondence, of what type of reincarnation a person is going to get based on the actions that they do. And for the Aztecs, we don't have that because of the missing records. We only have little hints here and there of what type of hell or what type of punishment or reincarnation was going to be correspondent to a particular action. But I'm pretty sure it existed, but the complete record is gone. Now, the Aztecs have multiple gods, and each one of those gods corresponded to one of the particular corners of the pyramids. And also dates corresponded to the particular times of the pyramids. That will probably be the next episode, to try to understand what do the dates mean. This is kind of important, or at least it was important, for those people that believed in the Maya calendar, the end of the Maya calendar for the next age. Because the Aztecs believe in very similar gods, they believe in very similar ages, and so therefore it will be useful for us to know how do those dates are supposed to influence reality. This is deeply intertwined with creation stories, where the Maya and the Aztecs also have a very long tradition of how the gods tried to create humanity, but humanity kind of failed, and then they tried again and failed again, and they did that 4 times, and then the 5th one they got it right. The Popol Vuh says the same thing. Aztec also, shall we say, codices and engravings in walls have a very similar type of tradition. And so we're going to speak a little bit about that in the next episode. I hope didn't gross you out. Maybe in the future I will talk more about human sacrifice and what does it mean in a perspective of a religious and magical perspective. But there's a lot to cover. Anyway, please stay tuned. If you like to subscribe and ring the bell, I would really appreciate it, to try to expand this knowledge. Once again, I'm trying to base myself more in academic records, more than in legends and stories, and I will try to make the references as clearly as possible and try to put them on the bottom. Anyway, thank you very much and have a great week. Bye bye.